The DNA screen did not say Diane Mercer. The woman I had called mom my entire life was my mother. It placed her in the range of an aunt. I called the testing company and made them verify that neither profile had been switched. They had not. I am Hannah Mercer, 34, a title examiner in Dayton, Ohio, and I had built my life on being the only daughter of Mark and Diane Mercer. Since my father died 7 years ago, that certainty had felt like the last unbroken piece of my family. Yet my gray-green eyes looked more like Aunt Claire's, Diane's younger sister, and Claire remembered details of my infancy that Mom brushed aside. When I showed Diane the result, she called it garbage and ordered me to delete the account. I stopped asking for reassurance. I requested my certified birth file. Diane warned that if I kept digging before the family company was sold, I should not expect to remain part of the transaction. Finding out who I was might cost me the family I thought I had. The next morning, losing my family felt less frightening than the possibility that I had never been told who my family was. I drove to the county vital records office before work with my identification and the mechanical pencil that had belonged to my father, Mark Mercer. I used it whenever I had to untangle a broken title chain. I had never imagined using it on myself. The clerk explained that my birth certificate was a delayed registration. The record had been filed weeks after the birthday I had celebrated for 34 years. When I requested the supporting file, she warned that older records could be incomplete. What she handed me was worse than incomplete. There was no hospital certification, no physician, no midwife, no contemporaneous medical record. The file rested on family affidavits stating that Diane Mercer had delivered me at home. I read my mother's name until it looked less like a fact than a claim. At work, I spread copies across my desk. As a residential title examiner, I never trust a document simply because it carries a seal. If a deed appears without a clean predecessor, I trace backward until I understand how the claim was created. My own chain did not begin with my birth. It began weeks later with relatives saying what had happened. I called Diane during lunch. Mom, why was my birth registered late? She paused, then said paperwork had been the last thing on her mind after a difficult home birth. I asked who had attended. She said my father had helped her. I reminded her that Mark once told me he had been out of town for work around the week I was born. Her voice sharpened. Memories blurred after 3 decades, she said. The DNA company had poisoned my judgment. I was treating my own mother like a suspect. I wanted to apologize just to make her sound like Mom again. Instead, I asked where she kept the things from my infancy. Diane told me they were private family property and ended the call. Her refusal gave me my next step. Mark had left several boxes to me by name when he died, and some remained in the upstairs storage room at Diane's house. That evening, while she was out, I went only to the boxes that were mine. Beneath old birthday cards, I found a faded yellow hand-knit blanket. I knew it immediately. Mom had shown it to me throughout childhood and said she wrapped me in it after delivering me in the upstairs bedroom during a summer storm. I held it against my chest, embarrassed by how badly I wanted fabric to settle a genetic question. Still, it was the oldest object I knew from the story of my birth. If the paperwork had begun weeks later, the blanket seemed to reach further back. I called Aunt Claire from the storage room. Claire Bennett, Diane's younger sister, had been the safest person in my family since Dad died. She owned a small bakery in a building leased from Diane and remembered parts of my childhood Mom forgot. When her face appeared on my phone, I held up the blanket. Claire stopped moving. "Where did you get that?" she asked. I told her and asked why she looked frightened. She denied being frightened, looked away, and said every family had old baby things. Then she ended the call with an excuse about a bakery delivery. I sat there staring at the dark screen. Mom had called the blanket proof that she gave birth to me. Claire had looked at it as if I had pulled a secret into daylight. I drove straight to Claire's bakery before she closed. She was wiping down the counter when I entered, and the moment she saw the blanket under my arm, she locked the door. I asked one question. "Were you in Dayton when I was born?" Diane had always said her younger sister was away that summer, trying to start over somewhere out west. Claire stared at the floor, then admitted she had been in Dayton. I asked why Mom had lied. Claire whispered that there were things Diane should have told me herself. When I demanded to know what things, she said answering me would cost me more than a story about my birth. I would lose people. I told her I was already losing them. Then I asked whether the yellow blanket had belonged to her. Claire did not answer. She touched one corner with 2 fingers and pulled her hand back. That was the first moment I understood that Claire's tenderness toward me might have a history I had never been allowed to see. I asked whether she had known my birth certificate was filed late. She said she knew there had been paperwork after I came home. Came home from where? I asked. Her face changed and she claimed she had used the wrong words. I heard myself laugh, a small sound I barely recognized. Claire begged me not to confront Diane until after the sale of Mercer Residential Holdings. The company my father had built with Diane was supposed to close in less than 2 weeks. Claire said everything was already unstable. I also knew Diane owned the building where Claire ran her bakery. I asked whether Mom had threatened her lease. Claire said no, but would not meet my eyes. I told her we were having dinner at Diane's that night and that I expected the truth. Claire whispered, "Hannah, please do not make me choose." I told her someone had made choices about my life before I could speak. Diane was waiting at the dining table when Claire and I arrived. She had set 3 places as if this were an ordinary meal, but nobody touched the food. I put the delayed birth file beside my plate, then the yellow blanket. I told Diane what the county file contained and what it did not. She said home births were documented differently decades ago. I asked for one person outside our family who had seen her pregnant with me or attended the birth. She accused me of humiliating her. Claire quietly said Diane's name, and Mom snapped at her to stay out of it. I looked between the 2 sisters and realized I had spent my whole life mistaking their silences for ordinary family tension. I asked why Claire had been in Dayton when I was born. Diane said Claire was confused. Claire answered, "I am not confused." The balance at the table shifted. Diane stood and said I was tearing apart my father's family because a website had given me a result I did not like. She reminded me that the company sale could provide me with more money than I had ever had, and asked whether that was what this was really about. The accusation landed exactly where she intended. For a moment, I saw myself through her version of me: greedy, disloyal, ungrateful. Then I looked at the empty place in my file where a medical witness should have been. "I want to know where I came from," I said. Diane's face hardened. "You came from this family. That is not an answer." Claire stood and told her to stop. Diane turned on her. "You left her on my porch and disappeared. Do not stand there pretending you get to judge me now." No one moved. Claire had not merely been in Dayton when I was born. According to the woman who raised me, Claire had brought me to that house as a newborn. I asked Diane why an abandoned baby later had a birth certificate naming her as the mother. She told me to get out. When I did not move, she opened the front door and held out her hand for my key. She said that if I wanted to treat the Mercers like strangers, I could start by living like one. I placed the key in her palm and took the yellow blanket with me. Claire followed me onto the porch, but I could not bear another partial truth. Behind us, Diane locked the door. I stood outside the house where I had grown up holding the object that was supposed to prove I belonged there. Now it proved only that the story of my birth had existed before the paperwork, and someone inside that house was desperate to keep me from learning what it really said. The lock clicking behind me changed the question. I was no longer trying to prove that Diane had lied about one DNA result. I needed something that existed before her version of my life did. I drove home with the yellow blanket on the passenger seat and opened the same public record systems I used when a property history went cold. I searched the date on my birth certificate, the Mercer address, police calls, fire responses, anything that might have put an outside witness at that house. Most records from more than 3 decades ago were not searchable online. By morning, I had filed requests with the county archive and the old sheriff's records unit. I did not tell Diane. She had already taken my key. I was not going to hand her the map to the only trail I had left. 2 days later, a records clerk called while I was at work. She had found an index entry tied to the Mercer address during the early hours of the date listed as my birth. An infant-related call, canceled at the scene. There was no surviving full report, only the index and an officer's initials. The entry was time-stamped before dawn. Diane had told me she delivered me upstairs during a storm. Now a county record placed an infant emergency outside her house. I requested a certified copy and asked who the initials belonged to. The clerk found the name on an old roster, Elaine Porter. Elaine Porter had been a young county deputy then and was now retired. I located her through an old Public Employee Association directory and sent a letter with only what I could prove. My name, the Mercer address, the date, and the canceled infant call. I did not mention Claire. Elaine called me later and said she remembered the Mercer name, but did not want to enter a family dispute. I asked whether she would meet long enough to look at one object. She agreed to a coffee shop outside Dayton. Elaine kept a canvas purse zipped beside her while I explained how I had found her. Then I placed the folded yellow blanket on the table. She stared at a faded corner. "I remember that," she said. My hands went cold. Elaine warned me that memory was not an official report, then told me only what she personally recalled. She had been dispatched because someone reported a newborn crying near the Mercer porch. When she arrived, an infant wrapped in a yellow knitted blanket was there. And Diane was there too. I asked the question that mattered most. Was the baby inside the house when you arrived? Elaine looked directly at me. No. The blanket had been the one physical thing I still associated with Diane's story of giving birth to me. Elaine had just placed it on a porch. The old story did not bend anymore. It broke. I asked why the call had been canceled. Elaine said her supervisor arrived, spoke privately with the family, and ordered the matter treated as a family issue. Then she opened her purse and removed a small spiral notebook sealed inside plastic. She had kept some early patrol notebooks because young officers often wrote down details that departments did not preserve. Elaine found the date herself. There were 2 entries tied to the Mercer address. The first matched the dispatch. The second recorded a telephone contact later that morning from a young woman who identified herself as Claire Brooks. Brooks was Claire's maiden name. Beside it, Elaine had written, "My sister has the baby." I read the sentence twice. Diane's younger sister, the woman I had always called Aunt Claire, had not merely been in Dayton. She had called law enforcement and connected herself directly to the infant on the porch. I asked whether Claire had said the baby was abandoned. Elaine shook her head. Her note described a family dispute. She remembered Claire sounding frightened and insisting that her sister had the baby, not that a stranger had found one. The scene had felt to Elaine less like an abandoned infant than adults arguing over who was supposed to keep her. With Elaine's permission, I photographed the pages and asked whether she would let the archive compare her notebook with the surviving dispatch index. She agreed as long as I did not ask her to guess about things she could no longer remember. Before we left, she touched the blanket and said, "That was around the baby when I got there." I carried it back to my car differently. For the first time, I had an independent witness who had seen the beginning of my life before Diane's delayed birth record existed. I went to Claire's bakery the next afternoon with copies, not theories. Claire Bennett, my supposed aunt and the person who had been my safest family confidant since Dad died, read the dispatch index first. When I put Elaine's notebook photograph beside it, the color left her face. I asked whether she made that call. She said yes. I asked whether I was the baby on the porch. Claire whispered that it was not as simple as Diane made it sound. I told her simplicity was no longer what I wanted. I wanted facts I could verify. Claire admitted I had not been born in Diane's house. When I asked where I had been born, she walked into the bakery's back room. I followed only to the doorway. She said I was hurting her. I said I believed her, but pain did not turn silence into protection. Then I asked whether my father, Mark Mercer, had known. Claire pressed her hands against the prep table. Mark did not know the whole truth. Hearing Dad's name made the room tilt. Until then, I had kept one private hope alive that perhaps he had known, and there was an explanation he had chosen not to give me. Claire's answer took even that away. I asked where I was born one last time. Claire looked toward the front windows as if she expected Diane to appear. Finally, she said, "Look for St. Anne's." She told me it had been a small maternity center and had closed years ago. When I asked what connection it had to me, she refused to answer. "If you find records, let the records tell you." Before I left, she caught my wrist and begged me not to tell Diane she had given me the name. I pulled free. If you are afraid of what she will do because I know one name, this was never just a family misunderstanding. St. Anne's had vanished as a business, but not from the public record. I searched corporate filings and court indexes until I found a civil case from years after the center closed. Several exhibits had been preserved by the county court archive, including one described as a historical delivery register. The online docket listed no patient names. I requested access and was told retrieval would take several business days. For the first time since the DNA result, I could see a path toward a record created on the night I was actually born, before anyone had time to rewrite who my mother was. Then an email arrived from an attorney representing Mercer Residential Holdings. Because I had raised a dispute concerning my legal and biological relationship to Diane Mercer, any expected distribution to me from the pending company sale was being frozen while eligibility was reviewed. The closing was less than 2 weeks away. The attorney warned me not to interfere with company records or make unsupported accusations to the buyer. Diane could not erase the county index already in my hands, but she could make every next step cost me something. I printed the email and placed it beside my delayed birth registration, the dispatch entry placing a newborn at the Mercer house before dawn, and Elaine's note recording Claire saying, "My sister has the baby." Those statements could not all belong to the same honest story. Somewhere between the porch and the paperwork, possession of a baby had been turned into motherhood on paper. Now Diane was freezing money while I waited for the one record that might reveal where that baby had actually come from. The more I looked at those records, the less I could tolerate being told to trust a story because it had been repeated for 34 years. My delayed birth registration said Diane Mercer gave birth to me at home. The dispatch index placed a newborn on the Mercer porch before dawn. Elaine Porter's notebook recorded Claire Brooks saying, "My sister has the baby." I did not yet know how those facts fit together, but I knew what I needed next. A second genetic comparison that did not depend on the consumer DNA company Diane had dismissed. I called her the morning after the company. Attorney froze my expected distribution and asked her to take an independent relationship test with me. Diane did not answer the question. She asked whether I understood what I was doing to my father's company before closing. I told her the test could end the argument. "Then end it by dropping this," she said. I asked again. She refused. That afternoon, Diane's attorney sent me a confidentiality and release agreement. If I stopped challenging my parentage and agreed not to contact the buyer, the company would restore my expected distribution subject to the sale. The amount was enough to change my life. I stared at the signature line, then at the yellow blanket folded over my chair. If Diane truly believed the DNA result was nonsense, why was my silence worth hundreds of thousands of dollars? I refused and repeated my offer to use an independent laboratory chosen by both of us. Her attorney replied that Diane would not participate in harassing genetic demands. Uncle Tom called the next evening. Thomas Mercer, my father's younger brother and a minority board member of Mercer Residential Holdings, had known me all my life as his niece. Diane had told him I was threatening the sale over an ancestry website. I gave him only what I could document, the delayed birth file, the porch dispatch, and Elaine's notes. Tom said he knew nothing beyond what Mark had told the family, and Mark had always believed I was his and Diane's daughter. When I asked Tom to support an independent DNA test, he said he was not choosing sides. He wanted Mark's company protected. I could not build the truth from people deciding whether to believe me. I needed evidence that could stand when nobody wanted it. A closing preparation meeting was scheduled at the company office 3 days later. I still had a right to attend, because several assets Dad had left me by name were being discussed separately from the disputed distribution. Before I went, I made a choice I did not feel proud of. If Diane would not provide a sample voluntarily, I would try to obtain an item she had clearly discarded and submit it for informational kinship analysis. I read the laboratory's limitations carefully. The result would not establish legal parentage and would not replace a chain of custody test. It could only tell me whether the first consumer result had been wildly wrong about our genetic relationship. I told myself that distinction mattered. It did not make the plan feel clean. The meeting room smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner, exactly as it had when Dad was alive. Diane sat at the head of the table with her attorney, while Tom reviewed buyer documents 2 chairs away. Diane greeted me in the warm voice she used when other people were listening and asked whether I had reconsidered the agreement. I said I had reconsidered many things, but not that. For the next hour, I forced myself to focus on easements, tenant notices, and closing schedules while another part of me watched Diane's hands. She drank iced tea from a disposable company cup. Every time she lifted it, I felt ashamed of what I was waiting for. This was the woman who had packed my lunches, sat beside me in emergency rooms, and called me every Sunday after Dad died. I did not know whether those memories could coexist with what the records suggested. I only knew she would not let me test the claim she had made about my body since the day I was born. When the meeting ended, Diane left her cup beside a legal pad and walked out with her attorney. Tom remained near the far end of the room, talking with a property manager. I waited until the hallway emptied, then folded the abandoned cup into a clean evidence bag I had brought in my purse. My fingers shook so badly that the seal stuck to itself. I had barely slipped the bag into my tote when I heard Diane's heels in the hall. She came back through the doorway. I forgot my handbag. It hung on the back of her chair, less than 3 feet from me. Diane reached for it, then looked at me. "Why are you still here?" Before I could answer, Tom called from the hall, asking whether the buyer had approved revised insurance language. Diane turned toward him and began arguing about the wording. I said I had been checking my notes, picked up my folder, and left. Tom had no idea what he had interrupted. I did not look back until I reached my car. I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. What I had done felt like crossing a line I had spent my career insisting other people respect. I could explain where the cup came from, but I could not pretend Diane had agreed to what came next. I almost threw it away. Then her attorney reminded me again that my distribution would remain frozen until I stopped contesting the family record. I sealed the bag inside a second envelope and sent it to the laboratory. The waiting was worse than the act. Every morning I checked the court archive for the St. Anne's exhibit and the laboratory portal for the kinship result. The archive request remained pending. At work, I caught myself comparing my own history to a broken chain of title. A missing deed did not prove theft. A late filing did not prove fraud. One contradiction demanded another source. I repeated that to myself because I was frightened that wanting an answer too badly might make me mistake suspicion for truth. The result arrived 4 days later. I opened it alone in my apartment. The report excluded a mother-daughter relationship and found a level of relatedness consistent with a close collateral relative, with an aunt-niece relationship among the supported possibilities. I read the conclusion until the words stopped moving. A separate sample, examined by a separate laboratory, had pointed in the same direction as the consumer test. Diane was close blood family. She was not my biological mother. That was the moment the shape of the secret changed. I had spent days fearing I might belong to strangers. Instead, the evidence pulled me deeper into the same family. If Diane fit the genetic range of an aunt, then the truth might run through one of her siblings. The only sibling already attached to the night of my birth was Claire. Elaine's notebook preserved her maiden name. Claire had recognized the yellow blanket. Claire had admitted I was not born in Diane's house. I did not yet have the right to call her my mother, and I would not turn probability into fact. But for the first time, the path toward my biological origin had a living person standing at the end of it. I printed the report and drove to Claire's bakery after closing. Claire Bennett, my supposed aunt, and the person who had been my safest family confidant since Dad died, let me in through the side door. I placed my delayed birth registration on the stainless steel prep table. Beside it, I put the dispatch index and Elaine's authenticated notebook pages. Then I added the new laboratory report. I told Claire exactly how I had obtained Diane's discarded cup and that the analysis was informational, not a legal determination. I watched her read the line excluding Diane as my mother. Claire sat down hard in a wooden chair. I asked one question. If I take a formal maternity test with you, what do you think it will say? She covered her mouth with both hands. For several seconds, she did not answer. I did not rescue her from the silence. Finally, she said she could not keep letting me tear pieces out of my own life because she was afraid. I asked what she meant. Claire shook her head and said she would take the test. Voluntarily? Yes. With identification and chain of custody? Yes. I asked whether Diane knew. Claire said no. I asked whether Diane had ever told her not to test with me. Claire looked toward the dark bakery windows and said Diane had warned her for years that reopening the past would destroy my memory of Dad and ruin everything they had protected. That was Claire's account of Diane's warning, not proof of Diane's intent. I wrote the distinction in my notebook because I no longer trusted myself to carry important facts only in memory. We scheduled collection at an accredited clinic for the following morning. Before I left, Claire asked whether I hated her. I told her I did not know enough yet to decide what I felt. I knew only that she had remained silent while I built my identity around a false maternal story. Biology would not erase that. She nodded and did not ask me to comfort her. The next morning, Claire and I sat across from each other in a clinic waiting room while a technician checked our identification. There were fluorescent lights, insurance forms, and a vending machine humming near the wall. The ordinary setting made the moment more brutal. Claire signed her consent. I signed mine. The technician collected our samples, sealed them in front of us, and recorded the chain of custody numbers. For the first time since the DNA screen appeared on my phone, I was not trying to take certainty from somebody else's discarded cup. I was asking a question openly, and another person was agreeing to answer it. I thought that would make me feel better. It did until Tom called as I walked out of the clinic. He asked whether I had authorized anyone to remove boxes from the old Mercer storage unit. I stopped beside my car. Those were the boxes I had been trying to inventory after Diane barred me from the house, including old company papers and some of Dad's records. I told him no. Tom said the unit had been cleared that morning on Diane's instructions as part of sale preparations. He did not know where everything had gone. Some boxes had been moved to company storage, some sent for shredding review, and some apparently taken elsewhere. I asked who had created an inventory. Tom said he would check. For the first time, he sounded less worried about my investigation than about what might have disappeared. I drove straight to the storage facility. The manager could confirm only that an authorized representative for Mercer Residential Holdings had accessed the unit and removed its contents. Because the company held the lease, he would not give me internal paperwork without permission or legal process. Through the open doorway, I saw empty metal shelves where Dad's old files had stood only weeks earlier. I had no proof that Diane had ordered anything destroyed. I did have proof that the physical trail was moving while I investigated it. From the parking lot, I called the clinic and confirmed that Claire's sealed sample had already been transferred to the laboratory under chain of custody. Then I sent copies of every document I possessed to an attorney I had retained personally and stored encrypted duplicates outside my apartment and workplace. Elaine's notebook images, the certified dispatch index, my delayed birth file, the independent kinship report, and the maternity test receipt no longer existed in only one place. I could not protect what had been in the storage unit, but I could stop the evidence already in my hands from disappearing with it. That evening, Diane called me directly for the first time since taking my key. She did not mention the storage unit. She asked whether I was ready to stop before I hurt people who had loved me. I asked where Dad's boxes had gone. She said the company was cleaning old records for closing, and that I had no right to interfere with business property. I told her some papers concerned my father's personal effects. Diane replied that if I kept treating routine business decisions like crimes, I was proving why no one should take my accusations seriously. I almost told her about Claire's test. Instead, I asked one last time whether she would take a voluntary independent relationship test with me. Diane said no. After we hung up, I placed the yellow blanket beside the clinic receipt and looked at the tracking number for Claire's sealed sample. Somewhere between the porch and the paperwork, someone had rewritten my beginning. Now Dad's old boxes were gone. Diane was closing off access wherever she could, and the only clean genetic answer I had left was already on its way to a laboratory. If that sample disappeared too, I did not know what trace of my real birth would remain. The maternity result arrived before sunrise. I had slept on the couch with my phone beside me because the clinic said the laboratory might post the report overnight. I opened the secure portal, checked the chain of custody numbers, then read the conclusion. Claire Bennett could not be excluded as my biological mother. The probability of maternity exceeded the laboratory's reporting threshold. I read it again because my mind kept trying to turn it into something smaller. Aunt Claire was not my aunt. Claire, Diane's younger sister, and the woman who had watched me grow up from a careful distance, was the woman who gave birth to me. I called her after 7. She answered on the first ring. I told her the result was posted and asked her to meet me at the bakery before opening. I wanted only what she could personally stand behind. Claire was already inside when I arrived, sitting at the prep table where I had laid out the records days earlier. I placed the accredited report between us. For the first time, I called her Claire instead of Aunt Claire. "You are my biological mother." She nodded. I asked whether Diane had known from the beginning. Claire said yes. I asked whether Diane had found me on the porch by accident. Claire closed her eyes. No, the porch was her idea. I made her slow down. I would not accept conclusions, only what she had done, seen, or been told. Claire said she had been 19 unmarried, frightened, and dependent on her family when she became pregnant. Diane, already married to my father, Mark Mercer, had also been expecting a baby. According to Claire, Diane lost that pregnancy while Mark was away for work and concealed the loss from him for a time. Months later, after Claire delivered me, Diane offered to care for me temporarily while Claire found work and a stable place to live. I asked why I ended up outside the house. Claire looked at the yellow blanket folded on the chair beside me. She said Diane instructed her to bring me before dawn, leave me wrapped in that blanket near the porch, and knock. Claire said Diane had been waiting and picked me up before Claire drove away. That was Claire's memory, not independent proof. But Elaine Porter's notebook already confirmed that an infant in a yellow blanket had been on the porch, and that Claire later called saying her sister had the baby. I asked why Claire never took me back. She said Diane began calling me her daughter almost immediately. When Claire tried to reclaim me, Diane reminded her that she had no money, no home of her own, and no official document naming her as my mother. Then the delayed birth registration appeared with Diane's name. Claire said their father supported Diane and warned that challenging the arrangement would destroy both families. I wrote those claims down without treating them as proven. "Why did you stay in my life?" I asked. Claire looked at me. Because leaving completely felt worse. I could not decide whether that made the betrayal smaller or larger. There was one part of Claire's account I could test, St. Anne's. I drove from the bakery to the county court archive after receiving notice that the civil case exhibit I had requested was ready. The archivist brought out a certified copy package from an old lawsuit involving the closed maternity center. One exhibit was a delivery register authenticated during that case. I went line by line until I found Claire's maiden name, Claire Brooks. Beside it was the record of a live baby girl delivered in the same narrow time window as the porch incident. The register did not name the infant Hannah. It did not need to. Claire's chain of custody maternity result established that I was her daughter. The register independently established that Claire had delivered a baby girl before the Mercer porch call. My delayed birth record, created weeks later, claimed Diane delivered me at home. Both records could not truthfully describe the same biological event. I paid for an expedited certified copy. Standing at the counter with the seal in my hand, I felt something inside me settle, not heal. Settle. Diane could dismiss the consumer DNA test, attack Elaine's memory, or call Claire confused. But now I had an accredited maternity test and an archived medical record from a source neither sister controlled. The truth had finally escaped the family. I gave copies to my attorney and authorized her to notify counsel handling the Mercer Residential Holdings sale that the parentage dispute was supported by independent evidence. I did not contact the buyer. I asked only that no closing document rely on Diane's claimed biological maternity without acknowledging the verified contradiction. Within hours, my employer's compliance director requested a video call. He said a complaint alleged that I had misused title databases and confidential professional access for a personal inheritance scheme. I knew who benefited from the accusation, but he did not identify the complainant, so I did not pretend I knew. I explained every source, my own vital record, public county archives, Elaine's voluntarily provided notebook, private laboratories, and a court exhibit. None came from a client title file. The director said my access logs still had to be reviewed. Until then, I was placed on administrative leave. I sat at my kitchen table afterward with my employee badge beside the yellow blanket. My career had been built on documenting where information came from. And now the existence of my investigation was being used to question whether I could be trusted with records at all. Diane's attorney sent a revised settlement offer that afternoon. If I signed a confidentiality agreement, withdrew my objections, and stopped presenting genetic claims to parties connected to the sale, Diane would support reinstatement of my expected distribution after closing. It was the same bargain wearing better clothes, money in exchange for silence. I declined through counsel. The next morning, Claire called and said Diane had come to the bakery before opening. I stopped her before she could tell me what Diane felt or intended. I asked what actually happened. Claire said Diane reminded her that the bakery operated in a building Diane controlled and that lease renewal was approaching. Claire said Diane did not explicitly threaten eviction, but asked whether she wanted to destroy the business over a mistake made when we were young. Then Claire told me Diane had said the porch was the only reason Mark accepted the timing without asking too many questions. Claire had heard that explanation years earlier during an argument after Dad died. Again, it was reported through Claire, not proof by itself. Still, the purpose of the porch was becoming clearer. It had not merely hidden Claire. It had helped create a story in which a newborn appeared at the Mercer home and could later be absorbed into Diane's delayed claim of maternity. I reconstructed the timeline on a long sheet of paper the way I would reconstruct a disputed title chain. Claire Brooks delivered a baby girl at St. Anne's. Hours later, a newborn in a yellow blanket was reported at the Myrtle Sussex. Claire called and said her sister had the baby. Weeks later, family affidavits created a delayed birth record naming Diane as the mother. Decades later, independent DNA excluded Diane as my mother and confirmed Claire. The sequence did not prove every private conversation Claire remembered, but it proved something larger. My identity had not been altered by one stray clerical error. It had been built through a series of acts. The closing reception was scheduled that evening at a hotel conference center outside Dayton. The regional buyer, counsel, lenders, and senior managers were gathering before final signatures planned for the next morning. My attorney told me I still had the right to attend because assets Dad had left me by name were part of the closing package. She warned me not to turn the event into a spectacle. I promised I would not. I wanted the documents acknowledged, not revenge. When I entered, conversations thinned around me. Uncle Tom found me near the doorway. Thomas Mercer, Dad's younger brother and a minority board member, looked exhausted. He said Diane had told the board I was manufacturing a parentage crisis because my distribution had been questioned. I asked what he believed. Tom said belief was no longer enough and asked whether I had proof. I handed him an indexed packet. My certified delayed registration, the dispatch index, Elaine's authenticated notes, the independent kinship result, Claire's chain of custody maternity report, and the certified St. Anne's exhibit. I left out speculation about motive. Tom read standing beside me. When he reached the maternity report, he sat down. Diane crossed the room before he finished. She wore navy and looked exactly like the mother who had attended every school ceremony of my childhood. For 1 second, I wanted to put the packet away. Then she saw the yellow blanket folded inside my tote and said loudly that I had stolen DNA, harassed her sister, and used company resources to invent a story for money. I told her the discarded cup analysis was informational and not the foundation of the maternity claim. I held up Claire's accredited report. This was voluntary. This has chain of custody. Diane said Claire was unstable and easily manipulated. A voice behind me answered, I signed it myself. Claire had entered the room. I had not asked her to come. She walked toward us and told Tom, the attorneys, and the buyer's counsel only what she personally knew. She had given birth to me. She had agreed to let Diane care for me temporarily, and she had brought me to the Mercer house. She did not claim to know what Diane told Mark. She did not guess at motives. For once, the narrowness of Claire's statement made it stronger. Diane looked at me. Does humiliating me in front of strangers make you feel like my daughter? I am not claiming to be your biological daughter, I said. That is the point. Her attorney tried to end the exchange, but buyer's counsel asked for the certified records. My attorney provided the same packet. I explained the chain without adding anything I could not source. My birth registration had been delayed. No medical witness supported Diane's home birth claim. A county record placed a newborn on the Mercer porch. Elaine's contemporaneous note connected Claire to that baby. Independent DNA excluded Diane as my mother. Claire's accredited test established maternity. The St. Anne's Register independently showed Claire delivering a baby girl in the same time window. Diane said none of it proved she had done anything wrong. I realized I no longer needed her confession. It proves you did not give birth to me, and it proves the record saying you did was created afterward. Tom asked Diane whether she had known Claire was my mother when the delayed registration was filed. Diane said this was not the place. Tom repeated the question. She refused to answer. That refusal did not prove motive. It did something else. It stopped the room from treating her version as the default. Buyer's counsel asked for a recess. Several minutes later, he returned and announced that final signatures would not proceed the next morning until representations involving beneficiary claims and possible document irregularities had been reviewed. Diane protested that the dispute had nothing to do with the company's properties. Counsel answered that a material family and estate representation connected to the transaction could not simply be ignored once documented evidence had been presented. The sale was paused. Diane still had lawyers, money, the house where I had grown up, and decades of people accustomed to believing her first, but she no longer controlled the only accepted version of my birth. The evidence now existed in court archives, laboratory files, legal offices, and the hands of people outside our family. My attorney touched my arm and quietly reminded me of the cost I had been avoiding. If the false maternal relationship was formally corrected, any distribution that depended specifically on my being Diane's biological descendant could disappear with it. I had forced the sale to stop by proving enough truth to make the lie dangerous. Now I had to decide whether I was willing to lose the money attached to that lie in order to keep my own name honest. The choice stopped feeling theoretical the morning after the sale was paused. My attorney laid 2 sets of documents across her conference table. On one side were the assets my father, Mark Mercer, had left to me by name. Those were mine regardless of biology. On the other was a disputed distribution tied to the company transaction and language treating me as Diane Mercer's biological descendant. If I formally corrected the maternal record, that claim could disappear. The amount was several $100,000. I had spent weeks insisting that records mattered because they told the truth. Now, the truth had reached a line that could cost me something I could not recover. My attorney asked what outcome I wanted. I did not want to destroy the company Dad had built or pretend I knew what legal consequences would follow from the false affidavits. I wanted one thing. No institution should keep calling Diane my biological mother because the lie benefited me. I authorized my attorney to begin the proper correction process and preserve the evidence for official review. I also signed a statement that I would not assert the disputed descendant-based distribution. My hand shook when I signed my name. For most of my life, Diane had made security and family loyalty feel like the same thing. College help, emergency checks, the promise that I would someday benefit from the company, all of it came with unspoken rules about what could be questioned. Now the price was visible. Keeping the disputed money meant accepting a maternal identity I knew was false. I walked away from it. Claire called that afternoon. We met at her bakery after closing. Claire Bennett was still my aunt on the familiar family documents I had grown up with, but the accredited maternity test had established that she was my biological mother. She asked the question she had been circling for days. Do I have the right to call myself your mother now? I looked at the woman who had remembered my favorite birthday cake, mailed me care packages in college, and stood beside me at Dad's funeral while allowing me to believe she was only my aunt. DNA tells me you gave birth to me, I said. It does not give us 34 years back. Claire nodded. I told her I was not ready for an instant mother-daughter relationship built on biology alone. If we were going to have anything real, silence could not be the price of keeping it. We agreed to meet once a week, somewhere outside Diane's property, and to answer what we could without filling gaps with guesses. It was not forgiveness. It was a boundary with a door in it. Before I left, Claire brought out the yellow hand-knit blanket I had left with her during the confusion around the company reception. She spread it over the prep table and touched the uneven stitching near one corner. Claire said she had knitted every stitch while she was pregnant with me. I asked whether anyone could verify that. She said probably not anymore. I appreciated the answer. Weeks earlier, my family would have turned memory into certainty because certainty was convenient. Claire was finally willing to let a memory remain a memory. She said that when she wrapped me in the blanket before taking me to Diane's house, she believed she was handing me over temporarily. She did not ask me to excuse what happened afterward. I took the blanket home. A few days later, Diane asked to meet. I chose a public coffee shop instead of the Mercer house. She arrived carrying a folder and began with practical matters. The buyer was reconsidering the transaction. Attorneys were reviewing old records. Uncle Tom, my father's younger brother and a minority board member, had demanded that company decisions involving the sale require more than Diane's approval. Then she pushed the folder toward me. Inside was another proposed agreement. She said I could still stop the damage. I closed the folder. I already started the correction. Diane stared at me. You are throwing away your father's money. No, I am refusing money that depends on me pretending you gave birth to me. Her face tightened when I called her Diane instead of Mom. It was the first time I had done it to her face. She told me a laboratory result did not erase the nights she stayed awake when I had a fever, the lunches she packed, the school concerts she attended, or the years she spent raising me. I told her those things were real. I remembered them. I was not trying to edit them out of my life. Then how can you do this to me? She asked. I heard the old trap inside the question. If I admitted she had loved me, I was supposed to excuse what she had done. If I condemned the lie, I was supposed to erase every decent memory. I refused both choices. You raised me, I said. You also let me live inside a false story about my own birth. Both are true. Diane said she had given me a family when Claire could not. I asked why that required a false birth record. She said the world had been different. Claire had been unstable. Mark needed a family, and everything had become complicated. Those were her explanations, not my obligations. I asked whether she had planned the porch scene so Mark would believe I had appeared at the house rather than come directly from Claire. Diane looked toward the window and said she would not discuss ancient accusations in public. I did not press for a confession. Needing one would give her power over the truth I already had. I told her any future relationship between us would depend on accountability. No money tied to silence. No pressure on Claire's bakery lease. No interference with the correction process. No claims that I had invented my identity for profit. Until then, I could not call her mom as if nothing had changed. Diane's eyes filled, but I did not know whether the tears came from grief, anger, fear, or something else. I knew only what I could see. She stood, left the unsigned agreement on the table, and walked away. That evening, I cried harder than I had when the first DNA result appeared. I was not grieving one mother and discovering another. I was grieving the belief that motherhood had ever been simple in my life. Claire had given birth to me and stayed silent. Diane had raised me and lied about where I came from. Dad had loved me without knowing the whole truth. None of those facts canceled the others. The external consequences arrived more slowly. My employer completed its audit and found no evidence that I had used client files or restricted title databases for the family investigation. The compliance director called me back from administrative leave. I returned to my desk with Dad's mechanical pencil and a different understanding of records. A record could protect truth. It could also preserve a lie for decades if nobody challenged its source. The company's sale did not collapse. According to documents my attorney received and information Uncle Tom later confirmed to me directly, the buyer continued negotiations only after governance changes and clarification of the disputed family representations. Diane no longer controlled the process alone. The transaction was eventually restructured, and the assets Dad had left me by name remained mine. I gave up the descendant-based distribution. Seeing the final figure hurt more than I expected. Truth did not make loss painless. It only made the loss mine to choose. The old affidavits and related records were preserved for formal review. I did not know what consequences would ultimately follow for Diane or anyone else involved, and I stopped trying to predict them. Diane had spent decades controlling the story of who belonged to whom. By fighting to preserve that control, she lost the right to define my relationship with her. Claire and I kept our weekly meetings. Sometimes we talked about my birth. Sometimes we talked about ordinary things because I did not want biology to turn every hour between us into an interrogation. If Claire remembered something, I called it her memory. If a record confirmed it, I called it documented. If neither of us knew, we let the space remain empty. The hardest decision came when the correction paperwork asked what surname I intended to use. People assumed I would take Claire's current surname, Bennett, or return to her maiden name, Brooks. For several days, I wrote each possibility on scraps of paper. Hannah Bennett looked like a woman I had never been. Hannah Brooks belonged to a history I had only just uncovered. Hannah Mercer was the name Diane had helped place on a false birth story, but it was also the name Dad had called across the backyard when I was a child, the name on my college diploma, and the name attached to every honest day's work I had done. I finally understood that keeping Mercer did not mean Diane owned the ending. Mark Mercer had loved me without a biological connection, and as far as the evidence showed, without knowing the truth of my birth. I could not give him back the chance to choose with full knowledge. I could choose now. I kept the surname Mercer, not as proof that Diane's story had been right, but because my lived life was not counterfeit, merely because part of its beginning had been. When the corrected maternal record was moving through the proper process, I bought a cedar keepsake box. I placed the yellow blanket inside, folded so the uneven corner Claire remembered knitting remained visible. Then I made 2 archival cards. On the first I wrote, Baby Girl Brooks. On the second I wrote, Hannah Mercer. For a long time, I held both cards above the box. The old version of me would have wanted to know which one was the real identity and which had to disappear. That was how Diane had taught me to understand belonging. One story survived by erasing another. I placed both cards beside the blanket. I did not cross either one out.